Iran insists that it needs to be able to continue to enrich uranium. Why would a country like Iran waste so much money? And we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars on a program that is not really intent on fulfilling energy needs. Why would they want it if not to have a nuclear weapon? The Islamic Republic of Iran, which has a checkered history in terms of its relations with the US, there's one moment in its history that it will never forget. That's the Iran-Iraq War. That's a war that lasted almost 10 years, which is, it was a devastating war. It was the largest land-based war since the Second World War. They were invaded by Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Saddam Hussein's Iraq used chemical weapons against Iran. Virtually no country in the world sided with Iran. The United States, every European country, the Soviet Union at the time, they all sided with Saddam Hussein. They all were quiet about the use of chemical weapons. In fact, the US had provided some of the chemical product that Saddam Hussein used. So from Iran's perspective, that was seared in their memory. They need self-sufficiency, which is why, yes, they may want a nuclear weapon if they think it's necessary. And so to say to them, give up all of your nuclear program, it's unrealistic. You could say that's the only thing we're going to accept, but then accept that they're not going to have a diplomatic outcome. Or you understand that there's some need that has to be fulfilled on their side.
You're listening to Robert Malley there from our Wavemaker conversation that we had live at the Dreamland Theatre on Nantucket last summer, part of a series that I've been producing and hosting for the past few summers on Nantucket. For your background, Robert Malley served in the Biden administration as the chief U.S. envoy to Iran. His experience with Iran goes back and is much deeper than that. He was on the U.S. negotiating team under President Obama that reached the nuclear inspections accord with Iran back in 2015. He served as a key point person at the National Security Council for the U.S. in America's campaign against the Islamic State. He's going to take us behind the scenes in all those stories and really provide a lot of insight. Currently, Robert Malley is a senior fellow and lecturer at Yale University's Jackson School of Global Affairs. So without further ado, here's my full conversation with Robert Malley live at the Dreamland Theatre on Nantucket. We're in the third summer of Wavemaker Conversations at the Dreamland. And I want to thank Robert Malley for coming all the way here. You went to Harvard Law School and you never made it to Nantucket. What were you doing?
I don't think most students made it here, but maybe I'm wrong.
Okay. Well, let me just briefly tell you Robert Malley's bio: a graduate of Yale, Harvard Law School, Rhodes Scholar, on multiple U.S. negotiating teams that have worked to resolve the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. You were on the team that successfully negotiated the Iran nuclear inspection deal during the Obama administration. You were President Obama's point person on the campaign against the Islamic State. There's a lot to talk about today. And also chief U.S. envoy to Iran under President Biden. Robert is currently a fellow at Yale's Jackson Institute for Global Affairs. And he's teaching a class there on Israel-Palestine, which began shortly after October 7th, which we'll sort of get some of his notes on that and how he was able to run a class without acrimony, just light and not heat. Or maybe some heat, I don't know, but you'll tell me. Robert has a new book out. It's called Tomorrow is Yesterday: Life, Death, and the Pursuit of Peace in Israel-Palestine. And Tomorrow is Yesterday gives you a hint at where he's going, but I want Rob to read the first paragraph of that book, of the prologue.
Yeah. So first, thank you, and thanks all of you for coming to have this discussion with us. The book is out September 16th, so if you try to buy it now, you could pre-order it, but you can't actually buy it or get it. So I'll read the first paragraph. Time cannot move backwards. That would be absurd. Still, 30 years after the Oslo Accords, 30 years after setting out on an irreversible path to peace, Israelis and Palestinians are back where they were decades ago. The era of the peace process, of the two-state solution, has vanished. Peacemakers focused on repressing history by arbitrarily choosing a starting point and defining the conflict as a territorial spat. The challenge is one of drawing lines on a map. This did not reflect the reality, feelings, and yearnings of all of those upon whom this construct was imposed. Israelis wanted genuine acceptance and normalcy. They want eternal security, which is hard to distinguish from eternal dominance. Palestinians want justice and redemption, dignity and self-determination. They want a return to life that is no longer there.
And I mean, that paragraph in light of this week, when we have 3 world leaders calling for the recognition of a Palestinian state or saying they may recognize it, France, Great Britain, and Canada. And yet we're seeing that this is 30 years back. We've moved back in time, in your view. And by the way, as that passage continues, you write, and it's a chilling line, Israelis and Palestinians each seek refuge in the wish that the other side will vanish. So where are we right now at the moment? Are we back 30 years? Are we back farther? And bring us back to that starting point 30 years ago. In fact, Paul, if you can put the still image of that classic handshake sealing the Oslo Agreement, and if you look right there, you told me you were in the audience on the White House lawn at that time. Tell me about that. And you were not involved in those negotiations, but tell me how that set the stage for the next 30 years.
Yes, I was in the crowd, and I'm sure a lot of you were watching that moment, and it was a moment of extraordinary hope. In fact, I think if you had questioned the people in the audience, if you'd questioned people who were watching it, they would say, we are on an irreversible path to peace. That the only option was a two-state solution negotiated by the United States, and sooner or later we would get there. 7 years later, I was with President Clinton at Camp David trying to negotiate that deal. And the theme of the book is that for all the good intentions that might have existed, this was really just a bracket in the history of the relations between Israelis and Palestinians. And we are back at a time before Oslo, before the idea of the two-state solution as being inevitable, before the idea that the U.S. could mediate a negotiated settlement, where neither side really has a clear idea about where they're going. Some individuals on both sides may know, but there's no common frame between Israelis and Palestinians. There's no common destination. The two-state solution, I would argue, again, it may be the most commendable the best outcome for both people, but it is something that I think today is simply unachievable. And so we're back, as I say, or as Hussein Agha and I, because this is a co-authored book, as we write, we're back to a time where everything has to be reconsidered, everything from whether it's going to be a two-state solution or something completely different, whether it's going to be an imposed solution or a negotiated solution, and whether the U.S. is still capable, if it ever was, of playing the role of mediator.
And so just to pause on that moment for a little bit longer and bring us all back. Some of you were not alive when this actually happened, but Paul, I'd like you to play. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to play just about a minute and a half of the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin speaking, and followed by about a minute and a half of Yasser Arafat speaking. With Arafat, he gave the address in Arabic with a translator, but I kept some of the Arabic in the beginning, so you could just hear the tone of his voice and just the flavor of it. So why don't we roll those 2 videos and then we'll continue the conversation.
This signing of the Israeli-Palestinian Declaration of Principle here today, it's not so easy. Neither for myself as a soldier in Israel's war, nor for the people of Israel, nor to the Jewish people in the diaspora, who are watching us now with great hope mixed with apprehension. It is certainly not easy for the families of the victims of the wars, violence, terror, whose pain will never heal. We have come to try and put an end to the hostilities so that our children, our children's children, will no longer experience the painful cost of war, violence, and terror. We have come
وأقمى ضمانة لتحقيق الحياة المشتركة والانفتاح بين شعبينا وبين أجيالنا القادمة.
Now, as we stand on the threshold of this new historic era, let me address the people of Israel and their leaders with whom we are meeting today for the first time. And let me assure them that the difficult decision we reached together was one that required great and exceptional courage. We will need more courage and determination to continue the course of building coexistence and peace between us. This is possible, and it will happen with mutual determination and with the effort that will be made with all parties on all the tracks to establish the foundations of a just and comprehensive peace. Our people do not consider that exercising the right to self-determination could violate the rights of their neighbors or infringe on their security. Rather, putting an end to their feelings of being wronged and of having suffered an historic injustice.
So as you listen to that again, and you reflect on your experiences in the room at Camp David when Clinton this was earlier in his term, when he comes back near the end of his term and really tries to get this peace agreement moving a big step forward, and it doesn't work. What do you think when you're listening to that?
I mean, it's hard to, both of them made, remarkable speeches, historic speeches at the time. I think if we want to jump forward to 2000, which is when the Camp David summit occurs, this is Camp David summit. It's no longer Rabin because he was assassinated, but it's Prime Minister Barak. But Arafat is still there and Clinton is still there. And I think in hindsight, obviously it's not something that I would have said at the time, the gap in expectations between the two sides, which is hidden by, what both leaders say. I mean, I think if you're an Israeli leader at the time, and Israel had won, the war in 1948, where they declared their independence, and the Palestinians rejected, and the Arabs rejected, and attack Israel. So from Israel, and Israel then in '67 occupies the West Bank and Gaza. From an Israeli perspective, they're there as the party that is going to give land as an act of magnanimity, as an act of generosity. They won the war. They're now going to agree to the terms to give land to the Palestinians. And that's their great concession. Their concession from their perspective is, we won and we're the victor who's going to give land to the party that was vanquished. And who does that in history? And who does it in particular when the party on the other side has only vaguely reconciled with the fact that the Jewish state is going to exist in their heartland? From a Palestinian perspective, it's completely different. And again, you hear it in between the lines of what Yasser Arafat is saying. From his perspective, it's a matter of the Palestinians getting what was their due back. They never really accepted the fact that in 1948 they lost, from their perspective, 78% of the land. They thought that all the land, in theory, should have been theirs. It was just under the British mandate and then under the UN vote that they were deprived of 78% of their land. So for them, it's not a matter of, the Israelis are being generous to us. We're the ones who are wronged, and now we're going to negotiate. At a minimum, we're going to get back what we lost in '67. But even that is that enough when, in fact, we feel that we were wronged in 1948? So both of them come there with such different, it's not even a different perspective, it's a different assessment of what the conflict is about, and therefore what a fair solution is about. And for one side, it's, let's try, and you and I have spoken about this in terms of how you negotiate, and there's so many lessons to be learned about in this sense. From the Israeli perspective, and in the book we try to put ourselves in both sides' shoes. From the Israeli perspective, this notion that, we're the generous victor who's giving land, and from the Palestinian perspective, no, you're not giving us land, we're getting it back.
So now bring us into the rooms, because you were actually in the rooms. Did you spend a lot of your time in negotiations directly with Arafat, with Ehud Barak? Was it on separate teams? What was happening, and did anybody explode? Like, did people just vent and lay that history out, or was it more well-mannered?
I mean, every negotiation has been some people that sometimes vent, that otherwise it's not really a negotiation. So they did vent, and they vented one which goes to this, which was the Palestinian the chief Palestinian negotiator, or the second chief Palestinian negotiator, was with Clinton and showing him a map and saying, this is what we had in 1948. This is what we had pre-67, before the war, the Six-Day War in 67. And we want to go back to where it was in 67. And that for us is a concession because, again, we're agreeing to relinquish what we thought should have been ours in 1948. And President Clinton looked at that map and said, this is a joke. You're coming here and you're telling me all of the West Bank, all of Gaza, all of East Jerusalem, that's not a negotiation. And he starts yelling at him and walks out. Again, I don't think President Clinton was acting. I think from his perspective, again, and he had more internalized the Israeli perspective than the Palestinian one, for him to hear a Palestinian say that was to hear somebody who had rejected the notion of compromise, whereas, again, it was Abu Allah, the Palestinian negotiator, not Arafat, but Abu Allah. From his perspective, he thought, okay, this is a fair settlement. They took it in 67, we're going to get it back, and we're going to concede what we lost in 48. The negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians, and today would be very different, was extremely amicable. I mean, Israelis and Palestinians know each other well. The negotiators knew each other well. Some of the Palestinians had spent a long time in Israeli jails, spoke Hebrew fluently. But there was really, and I say this, camaraderie. They played golf together. They saw movies together. The leaders, that was a different matter. Ehud Barak, and again, we go into this in the book, Ehud Barak had this notion that if he met with Arafat, and remember, Ehud will not remember if you don't know this, but Ehud Barak was the one who insisted the only way we're going to solve this conflict is if we have a leaders' summit with President Clinton there, the pressure cooker of a negotiation. We're going to tell the Palestinians we have 2 weeks to reach a deal. Otherwise, it's over. The relationship with the U.S. will be over, and they'll never get anything back. So he thought that's the only way to force the Palestinians to make a decision. And once there, he refuses to meet with Arafat because he says, if I meet with him, he's going to pocket everything I tell him, and then he's going to say that's a starting point for the next negotiation. So it was a bit bizarre because he had insisted on this summit. He'd insisted that the leaders should attend, and then he refused to meet with his counterpart. But that's just one of the small aspects of the summit.
And just to tell me one more thing, and this gets into your personal background, which I find fascinating, because Arafat knew your father, and in the book I learned often cited your father. And, that's Simon Malley's son. And he remembered things about your father that actually weren't even true.
Yeah, I don't know that remember is the right word.
Well, remember is not.
He made up. I mean, he was.
But let us know. And by the way, his nickname was, they called him the Old Man.
Yeah, Palestinians all called him the Old Man.
Okay, so tell me about your father and him.
So, and it's good. So, you mentioned the course I teach at Yale. I always started, and your daughter took the course. You left that out, and she's sitting somewhere in the back. One thing I always do in the class, and I think it's important, is I ask everyone to give me their baggage. Where do they come from in terms of their intellectual background? Because I think I'm not objective. I recognize that, and I'll come to my background in a second. But I know I'm not objective because there's certain things that shaped me. And so when I look at this conflict, I don't look at it as a sort of abstract individual. I look at it with everything that made me who I am. And I try to be, and I tell the students, be aware of who you are so that you know why you're reacting a certain way and why somebody else may react very differently. So my father was an Egyptian Jew. He left Egypt in around 1945 to cover the United Nations, which had just been established, for a North African newspaper. But he was, even though he was Jewish, he was an Arab nationalist, never set foot in Israel, didn't really feel Jewish, and became a very, very pro-Palestinian. The first Palestinian I ever met was Arafat, which is a bit strange, but was on a holiday that my father had taken us to in Algeria, and all of a sudden Arafat walked in the friend's home with whom we were having dinner.
How old were you at the time?
I was at Yale, so I was,
oh, wow.
18, something like that. Didn't speak Arabic, so didn't understand a word of what they said all evening. But the point is, I try to come to terms with my own biases. I'm sure, again, people who, if and when you read the book, and I hope you do, you'll see, I'm sure you'll say, oh, that's not an objective statement, and I accept that. But I try hard, and I've tried it hard in negotiating between Israelis and Palestinians, Israelis and Syrians, the U.S. and Iran, the U.S. and Russia, because I also participated in those negotiations over Syria, to to realize where I'm coming from and where my counterpart is coming from. I think that can help. The record may show that we didn't always succeed, but I think it can help if you try to put yourself in the other side's shoes and understand why you're wearing the precise size of shoes that you are wearing.
Or should you be transparent? Because one of the things that's happening now in communities is families are split over this issue. And when a family, an older generation and a younger generation, are split, it's particularly upsetting because sometimes you can feel like you're talking past each other and you don't want to hurt the relationship. There's the classic negotiating expert, William Ury, whose work you're familiar with. We've talked about it. William Ury was the creator of the Harvard program on negotiation. He wrote the classic book, Getting to Yes. And Ury has talked about this idea of, putting yourself in the other people's shoes. You seem to do this all the time. Should you be transparent about your bias, or does it just come through in the negotiations?
I think you should be transparent, but I do want to make a point about William Ury and Roger Fisher. Again, some of you may be familiar with different negotiation techniques. There's the, one negotiation technique where I say I'm going to sell you the car for $10,000. The other side says $5,000. I say $9,000. They say $6,000. And there's no, that's just bargaining. And then and I'm not saying that's the bad way. So again, my bias showed because I kind of was dismissive about it. But the other one, which is called principled negotiation, which is you try to ground your position in something, in a principle that you could defend. And this came across in those negotiations in the divisions within the American team. Again, a big part of the negotiation was about what percentage of the West Bank would the Palestinians get back. The Israeli position back when you saw those pictures of 1993 was they could get 80% of the West Bank back. That's generous. Again, we won the war. Giving them 80%, okay, they may come back and say they want 90, we'll say 85. By the time the Palestinians had reacted, we're not going to take 80. By the time they come to Camp David, they were at about 90%. By the end of Camp David, it was 91%. Then a few months later, it went up to 94%. My position in the team, but I got overruled, was there's no principle on which you say 80, 90, and if there's no principle, that means there's no bottom. Like the Palestinians are going to keep going. They're going to keep saying, well, yesterday you said 80, and you said it was your bottom line. Today you say 85. Tomorrow you're going to say 90. So they never accepted any position as being the final position because they were always convinced there was something that was waiting behind. And so President Clinton would come and say, I just spoke to the Israelis, he'd say this to Arafat, 89% is the absolute bottom line. Arafat would say no. The next day he'd come and say, oh, miracle of miracles, they got to 92. My position was we need to ground this in something that we as Americans could defend, because we couldn't tell the Palestinians, well, 80% is pretty good or 90% is pretty good given how weak you are. That's, people don't really like to negotiate that way. So my view was it should be one for one, right? 100%. You could have land swaps, so it doesn't have to be the entirety of the West Bank. Maybe it's parts of the West Bank, parts of Israel proper that you would swap. But that we could defend. 100%, we could say, yeah, you had 100% in 67. You're going to get the equivalent of 100% tomorrow. Anyway, I was overruled. It never came to that. And as we say in the book, I'm not even sure that would have worked, because I don't think this is just a conflict about maps. But I do think in that sense, one's bias, I tried to put myself in the Palestinian shoes and thinking, why would they accept anything less than what Egypt accepted, which was 100%, than what Jordan accepted, which was 100%? They consider themselves, equal to others.
Egypt getting the entire Sinai back, which
Right.
Israel conquered, and Jordan getting the...
it was a smaller portion of Jordan that
Gotcha.
Israel had occupied. And that,
So let me ask you, so now here we are today, and there's just such a major humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, huge amount of destruction. There is widespread hunger. Israel's own data suggests that, given the amount of aid they've been sending and have reduced. I don't even know how you begin a conversation now, but you have actually met with leaders of Hamas, not recently. Tell us why you met them, where you met them, and did you learn anything that shaped how you, other than force, might be able to get through to them?
Yeah, so I'd say, first I met them this was not as a government official. My other hat that I've worn is as a head of a nonprofit or head of a division of a nonprofit organization called the International Crisis Group. And the principle behind the organization was to talk to all parties to try to find creative solutions to end war and build peace. And so our credo was, we would talk to everyone. I think we would draw some limits. I would not have spoken to any member of Al-Qaeda or of ISIS. Some people could even question why we drew the line there. But other than that, organizations, even those that resorted to violence, even those that resorted to violence against civilians, terrorist violence, we said we should talk to them if the goal is to make peace with them. If the goal is simply to destroy them, okay, that's not something we could do. But we believe.
And by the way, if I could just interrupt you for 1 second, because that co-author of the William Ury book, Roger Fisher, was, I think, about late 80s or 90 years old when I called him. I was working at CNN. It was clearly we were about to go to war against Iraq in 2003. And I called him because he believed so strongly in negotiation. I said, would you negotiate with Saddam Hussein? And without even missing a beat, he said, of course. I said, well, why? He said, because a negotiation doesn't mean that you're necessarily looking to achieve something. Sometimes it's just a matter of listening and learning. You're not obligated to get anywhere.
So I was going to say the two points I'd make. So Hamas, I met with the leadership. I have to say most of the people I met with are now dead, were killed. But I met with them mainly when they were either in Gaza or the West Bank, because some of the leaders were, or some of the lower level leaders were in the West Bank, or in Damascus where they took refuge. And there were several objectives. One is what you just said. I believe, again, as a negotiator or somebody who wants to be a negotiator, then you need to know what the other side stands for. Even if at the end of the day you're going to conclude what they stand for is completely unrealistic, unacceptable, and therefore there's no point in negotiating. But how do you know that if you don't have some kind of direct contact with them? Number one. So I do think that matters. Number two, don't be naive. I mean, I knew, and I hope I knew it then, I certainly know it now, that they're going to present their best face to you if they meet with an American. What are they? They're not going to start, expounding on their or sprouting their most intolerant rhetoric. So you've got to be aware of the fact that you're being played to some extent, right? And that you have to take what they say with a ton of grains of salt. But I still think it's useful. And sometimes there's a specific objective. And the reason I met with them most intensely sometime in the 2000s was, some of you may recall, an Israeli soldier, Gilad Shalit. And now people who think, considering where we are today, that really seems like ancient history. But there was one Israeli soldier who'd been kidnapped by Hamas. And there were attempts to get him out. And I was asked by Governor Richardson, who had been governor, had served as President Clinton's envoy to the UN, and he would then recycled himself as a negotiator, but as a private negotiator, and he was trying to help the family of Gilad Shalit negotiate to try to, or find ways to get him out. And so he asked me to serve, since he knew that I had some contacts with the Hamas leadership. So we did lots of back and forth between Israel and Damascus. I did with one of Richardson's colleagues.
So Damascus is where Hamas
Khalid Mishal, who is still now one of the leaders of Hamas, where he was, and we tried to see, is there a way to get him out? At the end of the day, we didn't succeed, although the deal that ultimately led to his release was very close to what Hamas was telling us 2 years earlier. So that's why I met with them, and I don't want to claim at all that if there had been a different policy towards Hamas, October 7th wouldn't have happened. I don't know that. That's a counterfactual. I think there's some leaders of Hamas for whom this had been the long-term objective. But again, in the book, Hussein Agha and I asked the question, if rather than saying when Hamas won the election, which they won in 2006, and they had a majority in parliament, if rather than saying at the time, we will boycott you, we will not talk to you, unless you accept everything that the party that you defeated, the mainstream Fatah movement, the other party, has their platform, which is recognition of Israel, renunciation of violence, and acceptance of all of the prior agreements. Unless you accept all of that and therefore renege your own ideology, we're not going to talk to you. And then Israel imposes not the blockade that we're seeing today, but a semi-blockade. If instead of that, there had been some engagement and discussions with them and telling them, here's concrete steps you need to take that are not, complete ideological revision, but you got to stop violence. I mean, we're not going to be talking to you as you're bombing Israelis. then maybe there's a way, and maybe there won't be a blockade. Maybe you could govern successfully in Gaza. I don't know. Again, we ask the question because that's what history is about. It's about the paths that have not been taken. Certainly, at a minimum, I think people would have to recognize that the path that was taken was a disaster. Not just in terms of Hamas and what happened in Gaza, and maybe there were a whole host of different roads that could have been taken, but it can't be that the best road was the run that led to October 7th and then to post-October 7th. And again, I would say the road that we took since Oslo of the U.S. seeking, and only the U.S. sort of monopolizing the process, trying to negotiate between Israelis and Palestinians a two-state solution, which we've done now for 25 years or so, we can't look at it and say, yeah, that was the best we could have done, because it's ended in bloodshed, disaster, tears, and famine.
So now let me move with you to Iran, because there was a very controversial agreement, but you were there. The agreement for full, transparent inspections of the Iran nuclear energy program, which they were using at the time to apparently seem to be developing a nuclear weapon, and they seem to be very close. How close did you assess that they were? And when you went in there, how were the Iranians? Bring us into the room with that. What was your goal? What was the U.S. goal going in? And what were the stumbling blocks that you feel the U.S. overcame to get that deal? And still, even after the deal, how can you know what you don't know?
A lot of questions there, which I don't know that I could address in entirety in the time we have. But let me just, because trying to make the connection with the prior conversation we had about Israelis and Palestinians and negotiations. So President Obama had one objective, and which he put to the team, which is, first of all, he said, the main threat that Iran presents is its nuclear program. There are many other things we don't like about Iran, the way Iran treats its own people, the weapons and support it provides to Hamas, Hezbollah, and other groups that are intent on attacking Israel, their policies towards Israel itself, and their refusal to recognize Israel. So there's a lot, and their ballistic missile program. But there's one thing that, in his view, rightly or wrongly, he felt would change the equation in the Middle East, is if Iran acquired a nuclear weapon. They had a nuclear program. They claimed that it was a peaceful nuclear program. I think nuclear experts and economists would say it didn't really add up. The kind of program they had really couldn't fulfill energy needs. But it was very important for them to be able to enrich uranium. And for those of you who follow the news today, it is still the stumbling block in the negotiations that then got interrupted between the Trump administration and Iran. Iran insists that it needs to be able to continue to enrich uranium, which, again, doesn't make a lot of economic sense. Now, this is where I think putting yourself in other people's shoes helps. Why would a country like Iran waste so much money? And we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars on a program that is not really intent on fulfilling energy needs. Maybe in the distant future, but they wouldn't need the program they had if that was their goal, right? Why would they want it if not to have a nuclear weapon? And if they say they're not going to have a nuclear weapon, why would they still insist on having an incipient enrichment program? So for those of you who are too young, as you made the point, I'm probably among the oldest here, Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, which has a checkered history in terms of its relations with the U.S., there's one moment in its history that it will never forget. That's the Iran-Iraq War. That's a war that lasted almost 10 years, which is, it was a devastating war. It was the largest land-based war since the Second World War. The numbers of Iranians who died, who were killed, it goes somewhere between 250,000 and 500,000, depending on the statistics. Part of it is because of the way Iran waged the war, which is to throw wave after wave of kids and young men because they were outgunned in terms of the weaponry, but just threw them at the Iraqis. But what did Iran find? They were aggressed. They were invaded. Nobody disputes that. They were invaded by Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Saddam Hussein's Iraq used chemical weapons against Iran. Virtually no country in the world sided with Iran. The United States, every European country, the Soviet Union at the time, they all sided with Saddam Hussein. They all were quiet about the use of chemical weapons. In fact, the U.S. had provided some of the chemical product that Saddam Hussein used against Iran. And then people and the U.S. intelligence knew that it was used by Iraq against Iran, and publicly the United States was saying, well, we don't really know, both sides may have used it. So from Iran's perspective, that was seared in their memory. They need self-sufficiency. They're never going to rely, and at least the Islamic Republic is never going to rely on any other party to come to their aid, which is why they want a nuclear program as a hedge. One day, yes, they may want a nuclear weapon if they think it's necessary, and it's why their ballistic missile program, which caused damage to Israel recently, that's why they're going to insist upon it. And so to say to them, give up all of your nuclear program and all of your ballistic missile program, which has been, I don't know if it's a Trump administration position today, but it was a U.S. position for a long time. It's unrealistic. I mean, you could say that's the only thing we're going to accept, but then accept that they're not going to have a diplomatic outcome. Or you understand that there's some need that has to be fulfilled on their side.
Okay, but did you figure that out just by your reading of history, or was it being in the room across the table from specific Iranians, if you could tell us who you were across the table from, that convinced you of this?
I mean, it's a little bit of both. I mean, I was not there at the very beginning of the secret negotiations between the U.S. and Iran back in 2012. I joined in 2014. I think by then, President Obama himself, he had figured out, he had said, we're going to let them enrich, we're going to allow them to preserve the principle of enrichment, but it's going to be a very constricted enrichment that will not present a threat to us. But then in the meetings with them, what was clear, and again, you got to take it with a huge grain of salt, because they and the foreign minister at the time, and I think somebody in the crowd I spoke to said that they heard him speak, Javad Zarif. He's no longer foreign minister, but he was at the time. He was educated in the U.S., extremely skillful negotiator. So what he said, he was trying to play his audience, and his audience in this case was the American negotiators or the American public. So he would have these fits where he'd say, you're insulting my dignity, and he'd walk out, and he'd throw things on the table, and he'd say, never threaten an Iranian. A lot of it was theater, but even behind the theater was a theme that he knew would resonate back home, and his audience was also back home. When he said, never threaten an Iranian, because that was a day when all of us came to him and say, this is the ultimatum, either you accept this deal or we're done. Of course, it was not a real ultimatum, but he walked out and he shouted at us, never threaten an Iranian. It became a meme all over Iran. They would have, I don't know if it was Twitter or whatever they had, but it was all over, never threaten an Iranian. So he knew that he was playing to the domestic audience because it resonated, at least with the political system there. Yes, don't act with Iranians as if you're going to go back to the time where they were not self-sufficient and where they're going to be at the mercy of the world because nobody's come to their defense. So I think it's a little bit of everything. It's the dynamic of the room, but also knowing Iran's history.
By the way, that was behind closed doors. He said it, but clearly he
repeated it, and it got leaked, and he leaked it, and blamed us for leaking it. But of course, why would he have leaked that story? But yeah.
I want to go to questions soon, because I'm sure a lot of you have questions, but my first job out of college was with a unit that helped negotiate the first Camp David Accords that succeeded with Israel. And
between Egypt and Israel, yeah.
I'm sorry, between Egypt and Israel. And one of the guys on that team was Sadat's former spokesperson, a real peace advocate named Tassin Bashir, great intellectual. And he so strongly believed in something called constituencies for peace, and taking actions that increase and strengthen the other side's constituencies for peace. I view so much through that framework now, and now I look at what's going on, what Hamas did, the specific Israeli response as it's gone on this long, and I know Hamas's attacks certainly seem to kill whatever constituency for peace there was, not entirely, but largely. I can't imagine what constituency for peace there is among the Palestinians. What are your insights on that? Because constituencies for peace, do they ever enter the minds of negotiators?
It's a good question. First, before we get to today, because I don't know where you're going to find the constituency for peace for a very long time. I mean, I can't imagine either side thinking, oh, now we're going to... I mean, there are the minorities on both sides that are saying it courageously, but most of them, that's not on their mind. I mean, could you imagine a Palestinian now sitting with an Israeli? It's very hard to imagine. Even some of the track twos that I'm engaged in, Palestinians, most of them will refuse to be in a room with an Israeli.
Did you say track twos?
Track two, sorry. That's unofficial talks between, like non-officials. Like I would meet with As a non-official, we'd bring together Israelis and Palestinians who were not official, but who had some connection to their leaderships, or at least had some constituency. But to your point, no, I think, I don't know that governments are very good at thinking about civil society and about building constituencies. But even when they are, they often get it wrong. And this is, again, I want to go back to sort of how we started this conversation. A lot of the peace process that started in 1993, the pictures you saw, was built around Israeli and Palestinian constituencies that we were comfortable with, we Americans. And it's a feature of life, and I think we have to resist it, at least as diplomats, but I think even as individuals, to gravitate towards people we're comfortable with. So Americans would gravitate towards those Palestinians or those Syrians or those Lebanese or whoever, or Iraqis who spoke their language, dressed more like they dressed, were Western educated often. But they're not necessarily the people who have the most weight in their own societies. And when you think about the constituencies who were not involved in the peace process, Hamas, the Palestinian refugees, so the Islamists, Hamas, the refugees, the diaspora, Palestinian citizens of Israel. And on the Israeli side, what about the religious constituencies? What about the settlers, the Orthodox communities? Those are the communities that, we Americans, we don't really know them. We're not that comfortable. They're unfamiliar. They're religious. What is this about? Why do you bring religion into the negotiating room? Why do you bring whatever it may be? But if they're not on board, then the process is going to be so vulnerable by attacks as it was yesterday, terrorist attacks by Hamas or Islamic Jihad, yesterday and today by settler violence or by religious Israelis that, as we speak, prayed on the Temple Mount and Haram al-Sharif, which violates at least a rule that had been established for some time. But if those constituencies are not brought on board, you could build this very shiny looking object of a peace process, but what roots will it have? And it didn't have roots.
So interesting. I once spoke on a totally unrelated matter, but it's relevant. I once spoke to a jury consultant, someone who he's hired for, choose members of the jury that he thinks will be inclined to support his client. And he told me that you can never pick all the right jury members. You look for that one person or two people who you think will side with you and who may have the stature to influence the other members of the jury behind closed doors. It feels a little similar to that.
And you and I spoke about something else, which I'm going to bring up. You may have wanted to bring it up, which is a technique that I think Roger Fisher and Uri use in a negotiation. Try to write the other side's victory speech at the end of the negotiation. If you can't do it, if you can't imagine writing the speech that the other side is going to have to give, then there's something wrong. Which, again, coming to my earlier point about why I don't like as much. I'm not a big fan of positional bargaining. That's I'll say 1,000, you'll say 100, or I'll say 900. Because you can't really write the victory speech. But if you have a principled position and you could write a speech and say, we stood up for our dignity, for our, whatever values we stand for, then you got something. And you'd ask me whether that ever happened. So a small anecdote, Secretary Kerry, who was leading the team in the negotiations between the US and Iran for the nuclear deal, he asked us, the team, to write the foreign minister's victory speech going home to Tehran saying, look at the deal I got. And we wrote it and we gave it to Zarif. There was a good idea and a bad execution. The good idea was to write it, handing it to him. He thought that was so humiliating. You don't think I could write my own speech? And he threw it back at us. So I think we had the right instinct, but it was a stupid idea to then think that he needed us to write that speech.
And thank you for putting yourself in my shoes, because you knew I wanted to ask that question, and I might have forgotten it. So this is how sensitive he is to everyone's perspective. I do want to open it up to questions, because I'm sure there's a lot that I've missed, and I'll start with you in the front.
So here we are today. So the question...
Could you introduce yourself? I'm sorry.
My name is Richard Raisman. I'm from Wisconsin. Here we are today, and I think everybody, I'm going to ask a question that probably everybody wants the answer to here. What does Israel do to resolve this conflict?
Which conflict? I hate to put it.
The conflict going on with
in
Hamas.
Gaza.
Yes, right now.
So,
what does Israel do?
So I usually don't, I don't take moralistic term because I don't think that really helps. I have to say in this case, I think there's only one answer. There has to be an immediate ceasefire. It cannot continue. What's happening in Gaza, I think regardless of what you thought about the history, whatever you thought about October 7th. At this point, I think it's crossed too many lines. Just has to stop. It's not getting the hostages out. In fact, I think my fears it's going to accelerate their demise, their death. It's not making anyone safer, and it is really, I mean, it is isolating Israel to, at a point that, I mean, I don't know when the last time it was as isolated in the international community. So, my own sense, Hamas is no longer really a threat. It doesn't mean that you don't have to find a way to deal with it, but it's no longer a military threat to Israel. This war has to end. It's not even a war anymore, frankly. It's really, it is one-sided, and end the blockade, end the attacks, negotiate an exchange between the hostages and Palestinians who are being held in Israel. But my own view on this, it's crossed too many lines that it just has to end. And that's and more Israelis are saying that. It still may well be a minority view in Israel. I don't want to speak for them, but I think you're hearing more and more Israelis who are saying enough is enough. This now has to end.
Just a quick follow-up on that, because the Arab League the other day came out, and I was sort of surprised by the statement, but they said, not only should there be a ceasefire, Hamas should lay down its weapons. Do you think that's productive and called for at this point?
Yeah, I mean, listen, it was a statement about the two-state solution and about Hamas laying down its arms and handing them over to the Palestinian Authority. It was a nice statement. So much of it sounded unrealistic that I don't, yes, it's important that Arab states are saying that, but again, I think there's nothing more important today than just to end what's happening in Gaza. The main reason is so that more kids don't die, but there's so many other reasons. I think it's a moral and strategic black hole that Israel is heading towards if it continues down this road.
Thank you for being here. My name is Marcus. I'm visiting from Germany. And, I was wondering, you as a negotiator, American bombs kill civilians. How can American negotiators be viewed as credible and unbiased?
It's a great question. I don't think the U.S. can be viewed as unbiased. And even when I was, back when I was in the administration, I would speak to Arab audiences. I'd say, forget about unbiased. You're not going to get that from the U.S. They're not.
Forget about what?
Unbiased.
And credible?
The U.S. is not an unbiased. The aspiration that I held, and as we say in the book, we failed, was at least to be an effective mediator. Forget about unbiased, forget about unprejudiced, be effective. We weren't effective. And a lot of the book, if anything, and some of my Israeli and Palestinian friends who read advanced copies said, what struck us most is that you're much tougher on the U.S. than on either Israel or the Palestinians. And that's, because I'm an American, but also because, it's hard to be an Israeli. It's hard to be a Palestinian. I mean, as you have to deal with your own constituencies. You have to deal with the threats that any outcome might present. But from an American point of view, with so much leverage, with so much power, that we did so little, and again, I count myself among those who did so little, that's something that is embarrassing. And so, no, you can't be, the aspiration can never be that for the U.S. to be unbiased. I don't even know today how the U.S. recovers because of the role it's played since October 7th, whether Palestinians will ever want them to play that role again. Maybe, I don't know. And I think the U.S. has paid a big price because of everything. I mean, I'm not kind to my former colleagues with whom I served, but no. So, and the real question is there another mediator out there that could play that role? I don't know. I mean, the U.S. really had everything going for it, right? I mean, the support it provides Israel, but also the desire that the Palestinians have had historically from being on America's side and getting American support. That's why Arafat is at the White House, not out of love for America, but out of dependency on America. So with all that power, with all that leverage, to have done so little, I think it's really a mark of a failed superpower, really, is what it is.
If I can follow up on your question, it's interesting. We were talking the other night about your role as coordinator for the Islamic State.
Against the Islamic State.
For the U.S. campaign against the Islamic State. I knew I left out the words for the campaign against the Islamic State. And you told me something interesting about how you calculated, how the U.S. calculated. Was it at the National Security Council that you were at the time?
Yes.
So how the U.S. calculated how many civilians it could put at risk going after an Islamic State fighter or leader. Tell us about that, because that's an interesting calculation.
I mean, every war against organizations that are well, it may be true against states as well. I've never been involved in one, but against non-state militias or parties or terrorist groups, it's always tricky, right? I mean, and that Israel has faced this dilemma. You try to kill one, but they surround themselves, as you know, they would cynically, but that's what they would do. They'd surround themselves with civilians, and there are. I mean, it sounds terrible, but there are these calculations. Is it 1 for 1? Is it 1 for 10? How many civilians can you put at risk? What's the collateral damage? I hate that term. What's the acceptable collateral damage?
And what was it with these officers?
I can't recall, because it depends. I mean, there's factors that go in, but it was, I don't want to give a number because I'll get it wrong. What is interesting is how Israel has shifted over time. And if there's a book you may want to read called Rise and Kill First by Ronen Bergman, I think he's an Israeli who wrote about the history of Israel's fight against terrorists and others, and how over time, those rules have loosened. And it's hard to imagine, but there was a time not that long ago, we're talking about the 2000s, where Israeli security service and military agonized over the killing of one senior leader, either of Islamic Jihad or of Hamas, because they were surrounded by family or by some civilians. And you compare that with where we are today, and it really is. I mean, and Israel is not alone. Other countries have had the same evolution, including the United States. But today, the ratio in Gaza is unlike anything Israel itself would have accepted in the past. And again, it's a worthy read just to see how far we've come. But yes, the U.S. did it as well. And I remember one case, and I can't get into details because of well, I think it may still be classified, but there was...
No, but you're among family here.
No, definitely. Okay. There was a bank that was owned by the Islamic State that had millions of dollars. And the Pentagon proposed to bomb it. And there were people living just in the neighborhood, and the Pentagon could not guarantee that no civilian would die. And I remember the numbers. It was like, 100 civilians might die, and to get $1 million or maybe it was $10 million or $100 million. I think it was $100 million. And I was thinking, so it's $1 million per person. Either was the president or the national security advisor disallowed the operation because of the ratio. But it was even, I remember thinking, this is how we're thinking now, that we're, because it would have done real damage to the Islamic State. And one could argue the damage it would have done to the Islamic State would have saved many, many more civilians, Americans that they might have tortured, or they might have kidnapped, but just Syrians or Iraqis. But to think in those terms, I mean, it's ugly business, but that's done all the time.
In some ways, for me, in some ways, it's encouraging because they're at least taking into account civilian casualties rather than...
One would hope they would, yes.
Well, you would hope, but if you feel the target is valuable enough, yes, yeah. One would hope they would. But I mean, I guess there's a big difference between different ratios have real impact now.
I think even Osama bin Laden, again, I can't recall, but I know they had to discuss how many people were surrounding him when they killed him, and if it was too many, would they have done it? And it's part of it is moral, part of it is public relations. I hate to say it, but that you really do you really help yourself? If you kill, even if you kill a terrorist, but if you kill 10, 20, 100 civilians next to them, have you not, in fact, given rise to the next generation of militants who are going to be so enraged by the fact that their mother, their daughter, their sister, or their brother has died, that they're going to decide to kill in the future? So that it's not just a moral issue, an ethical issue, it's also a strategic one.
Gotcha. Yes, over there.
Two names. One was Anwar Sadat, and I think you were at a formative age when he was assassinated. And there was joy from some, and there was pain from others. What was your, as you reflected on your biases and growing up and what you brought to the table, what was your reaction to his assassination? And then the second question had to do with John Kerry. But
it's a good question. I was at New Haven at the time. I remember hearing about it. I could remember being in shock. I can't remember beyond that. I will say it because it does go to the broader picture. I remember, my father who was Egyptian, but had no sympathy for Sadat and did not shed too many tears, as I recall. And I remember that did stick with me. So how I reacted, I wish I could answer. I don't
Okay.
claim that I remember that well.
That's all right. And John Kerry, I think, and this gets to the Abraham Accords, I think in 2016 he said there was zero possibility of economic relationships between Israel and Arab states. And I think I don't know the numbers, I think it's small, but Morocco and the UAE and somebody else, Bahrain, have growing economic relationships with Israel. So that seems like a good thing, but I'm curious whether you feel like that's going to be a part of the conversation that moves to a solution.
So first, I mean, it's a good point about adding to the list of things that we all got, and when I say we, so many of us got wrong. That the two-state solution was sort of inevitable, that the U.S. would be the key mediator, that, as you point out, that John Kerry, but he wasn't the only one who said it, that Arab states would not normalize relations with Israel before Israel had resolved its conflict with the Palestinians. Well, that turned out to be wrong because, as you say, UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan have all, in one way or another, normalized. Sudan, I think, then opted out, but all three others normalized. And I wouldn't rule out that others follow suit in the coming, well, once the war is over at a minimum, the war in Gaza. Given what I said earlier about my view that you should engage and talk to everyone, I don't have a principled position against. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I think one could make too much out of it. I mean, it's not as if the UAE, Morocco were at war with Israel. So normalize it. For people who say these are peace agreements, a peace agreement to me presupposes that the two countries were at war. They didn't have diplomatic relations, but we all know that they had very intensive intelligence, coordination, cooperation, and discussion. So this was putting it out in the open. Again, not necessarily a bad thing. I do think one thing that the message it sent to Palestinians, and this is sort of the flip side of it, is that they were being abandoned and that the Arab world was ignoring them and they were on their own. I don't think, as some have argued, that that's why Hamas attacked on October 7th. I think that's really a far-fetched interpretation. I don't think they did it in order to stop Saudi Arabia from normalizing with Israel. But I do think that it contributed to this broad sense among Palestinians that nobody cares for them, and the world needs to be reminded that they exist. So I'm not. I think if for me the best outcome would be for Arab countries that are now waiting, perhaps, to normalize, that they, if possible, use it as leverage to get the Israelis to act differently towards the Palestinians. Don't know if they'll do it. Really, the world changes in mysterious ways. As I said, it was a surprise to many of us when the Abraham Accords occurred. But if Saudi Arabia, which is the next, not necessarily the next country in line, but the country that Israel is most desirous of normalizing with, if they were to say, we're prepared to do it, and they're hinting at it already, but here's some conditions, here's some steps that Israel has to take, and here's some things that Israel has to refrain from doing, maybe at least it leads to better life for Palestinians. It may not mean that the conflict will be resolved, but at this point, a better life is certainly something that a lot of us, I think, would take.
Yes, back there, and then I'll move it over there.
Let's get back the hostages. The rest of the hostages, we could get over this quickly. But as far as peace in the Middle East goes, I don't think you guys can do it. From the grassroots people that I know on both sides, the Israelis feel that God gave that land to them through Isaac. The Islamic side feels that they lost that right, the Jews lost that right in the desert, and the land belongs to them. The whole thing that I see comes down to who does God love more, and that's what they're fighting about. Does he love the Israelis, the Jews, or does he love the descendants of Ismail?
Do you mind if I give him just a little context on our conversation right before?
Yeah.
So just a small. We started chatting. You were the first one here. She said, yeah, one of my closest friends is Muslim, and I'm Jewish, and we talk about religion a lot, but it's very hard to talk about the Middle East, and we stay away from it. You stay away, but he doesn't. Okay, so just for that context, but go ahead and...
I mean, a lot of what you say resonates with what we say in the book, although I'm not sure that it's only a matter of religion, but there is a major gap in narratives, historical narratives, expectations, and sense of what each side is entitled to. And the Oslo process tried to ignore all that and to say this is just a matter of drawing the right line on the map. We're going to ignore the question of religion. We're going to ignore the question of the Palestinian refugees. We're going to ignore the question of history. And we're going to try to just say, okay, we're going to divide it not in half. We're going to divide it and then let them live in peace. And that was not, as in the excerpt I read, that was not really talking to the deep-seated yearnings, whether they're religious, historical, or otherwise. Now, does that mean, and when you said we're not going to be able to, I don't know who the we was in that sentence, if you mean people who, sorry? Negotiators. And as I said, I have very tough on the negotiators. I do, the book is not, and I'm not, an inveterate pessimist. I'm no longer maybe as optimistic or as naive as I once was, but I'm not a pessimist because I do think Israelis and Palestinians are going to have to find some arrangement. It may not be peace as we all would like it to see. It may not be eternal, but some temporary arrangement because they have to coexist. And part of that coexistence is going to mean opening our minds to solutions that may not be the two-state solution, hard partition between states as we understand them, sovereign states as they were discussed during the Oslo process, something different. I don't know what that will be. Again, I may not even be around. I probably won't be around when that thing emerges. But something is going to come about. I don't know who will bring it about. It may be that Israelis and Palestinians of the kind, maybe religious Israelis, religious Palestinians. And one of the things that we mention in the book is that one of my colleagues brought some Orthodox Israelis, first time they were leaving, ultra-Orthodox Israelis, first time they left Israel, they traveled to Northern Ireland, and they spoke to Protestants and Catholics and heard about how they made peace, but neither side was prepared to give up their dream. Whether it's of a unified Ireland or whatever their dream may have been, that the IRA never gave that up. And they came out and they said, well, maybe there's a way to make peace where we hold on to our dream, the Palestinians hold on to their dreams, and we agree to some kind of earthly, temporary coexistence for as long as we could do it, and then we'll see what happens. Now, I'm not an Ireland expert. People tell me things are not all that great over there, but they're not killing each other the way they're killing each other in Gaza or in the West Bank. So our plea in the book is, let's not succumb to pessimism, but let's also not be prisoners of the orthodoxies of the past, that this has to be a two-state solution, that it has to be negotiated by the U.S., that it has to be negotiated. Maybe there's some other form that's going to come about, and we're hoping that just as the title of the book is Tomorrow's Yesterday, how did the two-state solution, the idea of the two-state solution come about? You had some Israelis and Palestinians who were minorities in their both camps because two-state solution was not popular with either side in a long period of stretch of time between 1948 and the 70s. But they started meeting and they started exploring these ideas, and they came out with this idea of a two-state solution with creative ideas. It didn't work. But maybe Israelis and Palestinians, maybe religious Israelis and Palestinians, maybe others will start quietly, secretly getting together, talking about different modes of coexistence, and then surprising all of us.
In reference to Iran, between the water shortages, the sanctions, and the age of the leadership, I would assume that Iran is going to self-destruct in some form, and what's going to emerge when that happens?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear between the what? I didn't hear
the water shortages.
Okay.
Which yes. I gather are quite severe.
Yes.
The sanctions that are tough, and the age of the leadership.
Yeah, so I do think that this is a regime that at some point will collapse. Some point could be a long time from now. I mean, there are many regimes in the world that have survived under conditions that you would assume North Korea, I don't want to compare the two, but North Korea doesn't exactly live in affluence and prosperity. They're under sanctions. I'm sure that, I'm sure that it's not an easy life. These are not similar societies. Iran has a much larger middle class that may well be quite, that may rise up. But you have on the one side the Revolutionary Guards who are intent on killing if that's what it takes to remain in power, and a population that may not be prepared to die in order to seize it from them. So I don't know. I don't make predictions on when regimes are going to collapse, because I think people have underestimated the resilience of regimes, and of North Korea being one, Iran may be another, and overestimated their resilience. People didn't really expect that the government of Hosni Mubarak in Egypt would fall when it did, or of Ben Ali in Tunisia, or even when the Syrian Bashar al-Assad fell. It fell at a time when people thought that he was there to stay. So I think we're very bad at predicting how and when regimes fall. But if you're telling me that in the longer term, and that could be a year or 20 years, the Islamic Republic will not be there anymore, I would agree with you, because I think it has reached, for some time, an ideological, an economic, a social impasse. Whether there will be a constituency of people that are going to rise up when they see how rising up has ended up for many of their neighbors. I mean, they look at Yemen, they look at Syria, they look at Egypt. It's not clear that they want to go through that. So I don't know what will happen. Maybe when the supreme leader dies and he's very old, maybe there'll be some kind of transition. Maybe it'll be a transition towards something better. Or maybe the young Revolutionary Guards will say, now it's our turn and we're going to have a more repressive, more militaristic regime. So I know that doesn't sound like a very clear prognosis of what the future will be, but that's in part because I think these things really, political scientists like the word scientist, but it's really not a science, and it depends on so many things that we just can't calculate.
Yes, go ahead.
You just talked about how we're going to go forward, right? I mean, you started saying it, and you kind of have a hard time predicting where we're going to go. But Israel is putting itself in a really difficult position right now, right? Because there's no real leadership in Gaza. If you were to be advising the Israeli government right now, what would you advise them to do tomorrow, over the next year, to kind of stabilize the situation and kind of get back to normalcy?
I mean, really tough question. The first thing, as I said, I think they just need to end this war. I do think that they have achieved, and it's not just me saying it. I think President Biden said it some time ago. I think many American officials are saying it off the record or on background these days, that in terms of their military objective of defeating Hamas, that's been done for quite some time. Hamas cannot repeat October 7th and cannot present any kind of real threat to Israel. Now, it doesn't mean that the future could be different, but at this point, they've achieved that goal. They need to end the war and then try to negotiate a deal to get the hostages out, which I assume is doable. I mean, the reason Hamas is holding the hostages is to get something in return, and what they really want in return is some Palestinian prisoners. So that I think that can be done. The longer term, how do you stabilize Gaza? I could tell you what I would want if I were advising the Israeli government. You would imagine there'd be some kind of Arab force that would rule Gaza, that you'd have some kind of transitional arrangement where Hamas would no longer be in power. You'd have Palestinian technocrats, but I don't believe any of that. Because I don't think, I put myself in the shoes of an Arab country, and maybe I'm going to be wrong, but if you were the leader of an Arab country, would you send soldiers to Gaza in that place, which is, God forsaken, it looks like the apocalypse, and where you're going to have gangs of marauding gangs that are going to go about trying to steal food, trying to attack you and knowing, by the way, that if there's any hint of Hamas reemerging, Israel is going to attack, as we all know they will, and you're going to have Arab forces there. What do? Do they protect the Israelis attacking? Do they protect the Palestinians? So I have ideas about what it could look like. I think at this point it's going to take some time, and unfortunately I thought this very soon after October 7th, that when this is resolved, the way Gaza is going to be run is going to be like some very, very vast refugee camp with the UN. I still think it would be UNRWA or some kind of UN organization that's going to take care of social needs, the food, medicine for the Palestinians. And then over time, something will emerge. But I don't see it happening overnight. And I think, frankly, the Biden administration wasted a lot of time coming up with ideas of the day after, when they should have focused on the day of and ending the war, and not thinking, well, let's end the war, but let's have it as part of this grand scheme of who's going to govern Gaza, because it's very hard to imagine something that would govern Gaza that the Israelis would be satisfied with, that Palestinians would be happy with, that Arabs would be happy with. So again, there are a lot of plans out there, and a lot of them make perfect sense on paper. It's hard to see how they could be implemented. And so, because one of the things that the Israelis will insist upon is that Hamas play no role. How does Hamas play no role? I mean, you know, as long as as Hamas has not been completely destroyed, and I don't think it's doable without basically killing every last Gazan. So Hamas will be present in some form because they're still there, they're organized, they had a lot of time to basically become the most powerful actor in Gaza, and even though they're not the most powerful perhaps today, well, they may be still the most powerful, they've lost a lot of power, but relative to others. So if Hamas will play some role behind the scenes, and if Israel is not prepared for that, then it's just hard to see how you're going to get some stable outcome. Again, let's at a minimum, get food in, end the killing, get medicine back in, and then and also have a deal on the hostages. And if Israel's condition, I mean, if the stumbling block for a deal is that Hamas insists that it's the end of the war and Israel is not prepared to give it, just give it. And then, you know, if Hamas presents a threat in the future, I'm sure Israel will not hesitate to act. But for now, let's just agree that it's the end of the war. That's the advice I would give to Israel. And again, I think you're hearing more and more voices in Israel, including from the security establishment, who are saying exactly that.
I want to wrap this up with one final question. Somebody who hasn't had an opportunity. Okay, right over there.
So as a younger American Jew, I'm curious sort of in a different direction. You mentioned briefly the division in our own community that this issue has created. And I wonder if there's any negotiating techniques or perspectives that help you navigate those tensions within your own family, perhaps, certainly the broader community here.
So you didn't mention at the beginning about talking about the class, and again, there's somebody who took the class who may be able to correct me, but what I found, and just spoken about the university campus, and then I'll try to extend it to family and other arenas. The campus is probably the worst place to have this discussion, right? I mean, it becomes so polarized, and people take positions they don't want to talk. The classroom, ironically, is the best, I think. I mean, I found that, if you're stuck with the same people for 13 weeks, 2 hours a week, you could decide that you're not going to talk to them, you're going to yell at them, but, that's kind of gets tiring after a while. So I think you force yourself to listen, and you may not agree, but you force yourself to listen, you force yourself to hear a perspective you may not have been familiar with. This year, I had an Israeli in the class, I had somebody of Palestinian origin. Certainly they didn't agree by the end, but I do think that they were able to listen and to try to get a sense of why that other side, because there's so many sides, not just two, saw it the way they did. Within my own family, my daughter's here, but she's not nobody in my family is a problem, but but there's some who disagree with me, but from, I don't need from one angle or another. It's not always easy, and I'm sure a lot of you have had those conversations where for some, if you view it in moral terms, and as I said earlier, for me right now the situation in Gaza is a moral question. But the conflict more broadly, you could view it as a moral question, but I'm not sure what conversation you could have. So morality comes in, but to try to put yourself in the other side's shoes, try to understand, again, why they view it the way they do. You may not agree in the end, and it may be tough, but I have found that that's, for me, a much more productive conversation, and I actually invite conversations with people who disagree with me, radically. I kind of find that more interesting than to talk to somebody who agrees with me on all issues. But I don't have the key, I don't have an answer, because I know many of my friends for whom this has caused ruptures that may never be healed. I don't know. But again, what I try to do is stay true to what I believe, but also open to hearing why somebody, particularly people who I may respect and who I may agree with on 80% of issues, but on this issue we may have a fundamental disagreement, but try to understand, again, what's the baggage, what is it that brought them to some place that is so utterly different from the destination that I reached. But I think it's very personal. Again, I don't know if it's true in your family, but as I said, I'm sure it's in many people's families, their communities, and just to try to try to have that conversation, have many conversations as you can. And sometimes it will work, and unfortunately, sometimes it probably won't.
It's such an important issue. You know, I just, as on ending on a note of optimism, having listened to you now and having read your book, and with that last question, I really feel like, first of all, the classroom is such an important place for you to be. So I'm grateful that my daughter got to take 2 classes with you. And I wonder, well, this is sort of a profit-making scheme, but I mean, if you could travel around extended family to extended family and do 13-week sessions, 2 hours a day, they'll make up. I mean,
what a life.
Yeah. So just as a, but I do think, I mean,
no,
that's...
but I don't want to, because it may sound a bit naive, because I really do think that it's not just a matter of talking, right? I mean, there may be some people who have views, maybe I've offended some people in this room, I don't know, who just cannot even understand how you don't see it from the perspective that they see it. Right. And so that is possible. I really don't want to sound like, but I enjoy those conversations in the classroom. I may come back next year and say, oh my God, I was so wrong. This class was terrible. But so far I've taught the Israeli-Palestinian class twice. And each time, in a very different dynamic both times, but in each time I think the students found a place where at least once a week, they don't feel like they can't say what they think. They could put it out there, and then they could hear somebody else say, this is why I think what you said either doesn't make sense or is missing some moral fiber or is ethically deficient or whatever it is. And the one I mentioned, there was one Israeli who had just come from Israel. Very close friends had died. Some people he knew had been hostages. Some family members had fought in Gaza. And he, at the end of every class, he'd come up to me and say, I learned something, but I still don't understand what it is that the other side doesn't see. And he's still, to this day, I'm sure, he's struggling because he doesn't understand why they can't see the world the way he sees it. And I found that fascinating. He changed over the semester, but deep down, he still felt very much that Israel was in the right and didn't quite figure out why other Americans in the class, in particular, would see it differently. And so I'll continue doing that. I don't know that I'm going to travel around the nation for 13-week, 2-hour sessions. But if people want that, and that's a possibility.
Maybe you could at least come back to Mid-Island.
I've never been there, but it sounds like a wonderful place.
Robert Malley, thank you so much for joining us.